The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Lyra did not know that a Tuesday could change a person's entire life, but this one did. She was standing in the kitchen of her small rented flat, still wearing her coat from work, when she saw it sitting on the table. Her mother had placed it there without a word, and that silence told Lyra everything she needed to know before she even touched it. The envelope was cream-colored and thick. It had a wax seal on the back, a deep burgundy stamp pressed with the image of a wolf mid-stride. She had seen that seal before in history books and in the newspaper photographs that came out every time the Alpha King made a public appearance. It was the seal of the ruling house. It was the seal of a man who had never once been denied anything he wanted. Lyra set her bag down slowly. She pulled off her coat and draped it over the back of the chair. Her mother stood near the sink, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the window above it. She was a thin woman, Eleanor Price, and that evening she looked even thinner than usual, as though the weight of whatever she knew was physically pressing down on her. "When did this come?" Lyra asked. "This morning," her mother said. "I signed for it." Lyra picked up the envelope. It was heavier than she expected. She turned it over in her hands and noticed that the wax seal had already been broken. She looked at her mother. "You opened it." Eleanor did not turn around. "You were at school. I needed to know." Lyra did not argue. She slid the letter out and unfolded it. The paper inside was different from ordinary paper, stiff and smooth, with a faint texture that felt almost like fabric. The words were printed cleanly in black ink, formal and precise. She read the whole thing twice before she set it down on the table. It was not a request, it was a notice. The Price family had a debt. It was old, decades old, traced back to her grandfather's time, when a desperate man had borrowed a great sum of money from the ruling family to save a failing business. The debt had passed from her grandfather to her father, and now, with her father 3 years gone and no estate to speak of, it had passed to her mother. The amount was more money than their family would ever see in 2 lifetimes, and the ruling house had decided to collect, but not in money. The letter offered a settlement. The debt would be cleared in full, every record of it erased. In exchange, a daughter of the Price family would enter into a formal marriage contract with King Callum Drace, Alpha King of the Northern Territories. The arrangement would be binding. The union would be permanent. A car would arrive to collect her in 4 days. Lyra read the last line again. The car would arrive to collect her. Not if you agree. Not please consider. Just, the car will come. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the table. Then she sat down in the kitchen chair and stayed there for a long time without speaking. Her mother still had not moved from the window. "How long have you known about this debt?" Lyra asked. Eleanor's shoulders rose slightly. "Since your father passed. The letters started coming about a month after the funeral. I ignored the first few. Then a man in a gray suit came to the door and told me it was real. I have been trying to find another way ever since. And there isn't one. No." Lyra looked at the envelope on the table. "Did they give you any choice at all? Any other option?" Eleanor finally turned. Her eyes were red, but dry. She had already done her crying, Lyra realized. She had been doing it in private for however long this had been going on. They said legal proceedings. They said the flat could be taken. They said your brother's medical arrangement could be affected if the debt was brought to a collection authority. She paused. "I did not want to tell you until I had to." Lyra thought about her younger brother, Oliver. He was 22, and he had been in a care facility for the past 3 years, following an accident that had left him with injuries that required constant support. He was the quietest, kindest person Lyra had ever known. He could not advocate for himself. He depended entirely on their ability to keep his arrangements stable and funded. She thought about all of that for about 4 minutes. Then she reached across the table and pulled the letter back toward her. "I will need a pen," she said. Her mother stared at her. "Lyra." "A pen, Mum, please." She signed her name at the bottom of the document in the space provided. Her handwriting was neat and controlled because she was a primary school teacher and she had spent years making sure it was. Her name looked ordinary and small against the size of the paper. Lyra Nora Price, 28 years old, school teacher, daughter, sister, and now, apparently, wife to a king. She capped the pen and set it down. The 4 days that followed were strange and quiet. Lyra told the school that she had a family situation requiring immediate attention, and that she would not be returning. The head teacher was kind about it, which made it worse. Her colleagues sent a card. One of them, a woman named Claire who taught the year above Lyra's class, came to the flat with flowers and sat with her for an hour, without asking too many questions. That was the kindest thing anyone did in those 4 days. Lyra packed 2 bags. She did not know what to pack for a palace, so she brought the things that made her feel like herself: her books, her cardigan that she wore on cold evenings, a photograph of her and Oliver from the year before his accident, the small jar of face cream she had used since she was 19, and her teaching planner, though she had no idea why. She supposed she was not quite ready to let go of that version of herself. She visited Oliver the day before the car came. He was having a good day, which was a relief. He recognized her immediately when she walked in, and he smiled. And that smile nearly undid everything she had been holding together. She sat with him for 2 hours and they watched a nature documentary about penguins, and she told him she was going away for a while but that she would write to him. He nodded, and held her hand, and asked if she had eaten lunch. She told him yes, even though she had not. She cried in her car on the way home. She let herself do it there, fully. And then she wiped her face and drove carefully, and went home, and made herself a cup of tea, and sat up most of the night reading a novel she had already read 3 times before. The car arrived the next morning at 8. It was not what she expected. She had imagined something flashy, long and black and obvious. Instead, it was a clean, dark gray vehicle with no markings on the outside. The driver was a woman, which surprised Lyra further. She was perhaps 50, with short silver hair and an expression that was professional and not unkind. She helped Lyra with her bags without being asked. "Miss Price," she said. "Yes," Lyra said. "I am Nora. I will be driving you today." A pause. "The journey is about 3 hours. There is water and something to eat in the back if you need it." Lyra thanked her. She got into the car and looked out the window as the flat disappeared behind her. Her mother had hugged her at the door, a tight, brief hug, the kind her mother had always given, not comfortable with extended feeling, but genuine in its pressure. She had not cried. Lyra had not expected her to. The drive was long. The landscape changed as they traveled north. The city thinned out, buildings replaced by fields, fields replaced by hills, hills becoming darker and steeper as the road wound upward. The sky was overcast. There was no rain, but the light was flat and gray, and the trees along the roadside stood bare and still. Lyra ate a small sandwich from the bag in the back without tasting it. She read a few pages of her book, and then gave up because she could not focus. She watched the road instead. She tried to think about what she knew of King Callum Drace. It was not much. He had become king at the age of 26, when his father died unexpectedly. He was now 34. He ruled the Northern Territories, which was a large and historically significant region that operated with considerable autonomy from the central government, a fact that had made him powerful and also, according to the papers, occasionally difficult for others in power to manage. He was not elected. His authority was inherited and reinforced by a structure that had existed for generations. She had seen his photograph several times. He was tall, with dark hair, and a face that seemed built for authority. Straight lines, no softness visible. He did not smile in photographs. She had read once, in a weekend magazine article she vaguely remembered, that he had never been photographed smiling. The article had framed this as intriguing. Standing in a court system or attending a formal state event, he looked like someone who had decided a long time ago that warmth was a form of weakness he could not afford. Lyra looked out the window and thought, "I have signed a document that binds me permanently to that person." She breathed in slowly through her nose. She breathed out. She did not allow herself to spiral, because spiraling would not change anything, and she had never found it useful. She was practical by nature. She had to be, growing up in a household held together by her mother's careful management of not quite enough money. She had learned early that panicking used up energy that was better spent on figuring out what to do next. So she pressed her back against the seat and looked at the hills going past and told herself, "You will simply have to learn the shape of this new life, one day at a time." The palace appeared when they turned a curve in the road that Lyra had not been expecting. She had thought there would be gates first, or a long approach, some kind of warning. Instead, there was a bend in the road, and then suddenly it was there, vast and gray-stoned against the sky, built into the hillside as though it had grown out of it. Towers at the corners, high windows, Walls that looked like they had stood for centuries and intended to stand for centuries more. Grounds spread out from it in every direction. Lawns, pathways, old trees with thick trunks. It was enormous. It was nothing like anywhere she had ever lived. The car passed through a gate, iron, tall, opened by a uniformed man who gave a brief nod as they passed, and then continued up a long straight drive lined with stone that clicked quietly under the tires. Lyra sat forward without realizing she was doing it. She gripped her coat in her lap. They stopped in front of a wide set of steps. 2 people were waiting at the top, a man with a tablet in his hands, and a woman in a dark blazer, who looked like someone who had never been flustered in her life. Neither of them was the king. Nora opened the door, and Lyra stepped out. The air was cooler up here than it had been in the city, and it smelled of stone and wet leaves and something clean that she could not name. She stood on the gravel and looked up at the building and felt, for just a moment, genuinely small. The woman in the blazer came down the steps with her hand extended. "Miss Price, welcome. I am Helen, the king's household coordinator. We have been expecting you. If you will follow me, I will show you to your rooms and explain the arrangements." Lyra shook her hand. "Thank you. Your bags will be brought up." Helen was already moving back up the steps with the kind of efficiency that left no room for hesitation. Lyra followed. Inside, the palace was warmer than the stone exterior suggested. The entry hall was high-ceilinged and lined with dark wood paneling. There were paintings on the walls, landscapes mostly, a few portraits, old and formal. The floors were polished. The light came from tall windows on the east side and from light fixtures that were elegant without being excessive. It smelled faintly of wood and something like beeswax. Helen moved quickly, pointing out rooms as they passed, giving Lyra information in steady, practical sentences, where the dining room was, where the library was, where she should and should not go without arrangement, what the household staff's names were, how requests were made, what time meals were served. Lyra tried to absorb it all and knew she was absorbing about half of it. They went up a wide staircase and along a carpeted corridor, and then Helen opened a door and stepped back to allow Lyra in first. The room was large. That was the first thing Lyra noticed. It was larger than her entire flat, with a window seat that looked out over the back lawns, and a fireplace on the far wall, where a small fire had already been lit. There was a bed with a high frame and heavy fabric. There was a writing desk. There was a reading chair positioned near the window, and when Lyra saw it, she felt the faintest flicker of something that was almost comfort, because it was exactly the kind of chair she would have chosen herself. "This is yours," Helen said. "The room through that door is a dressing room. Through the next door is a bathroom. Everything has been prepared for your arrival." A brief pause. "The king will meet with you this evening. Dinner is at 7. Dress is not formal. Tonight is an introductory meeting, not an occasion." She said it in a way that was not dismissive, but very much was informative. "If you need anything before then, please ring the bell by the fireplace." And then Helen left. Lyra stood in the center of the large quiet room and listened to the fire and the faint sound of wind outside the window. She unpacked her 2 bags slowly, putting her things away in the enormous wardrobe that felt slightly absurd, given how little she had brought. She put the photograph of herself and Oliver on the writing desk. She put her book on the chair by the window. She put her jar of face cream on the bathroom shelf and stood for a moment, looking at how out of place it looked among the glass bottles and fine-milled soaps that were already arranged there. She sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was the most comfortable thing she had ever sat on in her life. She checked the time. It was just past midday, 7 hours until dinner. She stood back up, went to the window, and looked out at the lawns and the trees beyond, dark and old and bare in the late autumn light. Somewhere in this building, there was a man whose name was on the same document as hers, a man she had never spoken to, a man who was now, by law and by the binding terms of a contract she had signed 4 days ago in her mother's kitchen, her husband. She thought about what that word meant. She had always imagined that one day she would fall in love with someone, a proper, ordinary falling, the kind that happened slowly and messily and felt like something she had chosen. She had not been in a hurry about it. She had dated a man named Patrick for about a year in her mid-20s, and it had been comfortable and then quietly over, and she had felt more relief than grief when it ended, which told her it had not been right. She had imagined there would be more time, more chances, A different story altogether. She looked at her reflection faintly in the glass of the window. Same face she had always had. Same eyes that her mother called gray, and that Lyra privately thought were more of a faded blue. Same dark hair pulled back because she had not thought about it this morning. 7 hours. She sat back in the reading chair and opened her book and read the same paragraph 4 times before she finally accepted that she was not going to concentrate on it, and instead just sat quietly with it open on her lap, watching the light move slowly across the lawns outside. At 6:45, she washed her face and changed into the best thing she had brought. A dark blue dress that she wore to school events, simple and clean. She looked at herself in the mirror and thought that she looked like someone about to attend a parents' evening, which was not exactly the image she had hoped for, but would have to do. She found her way back to the dining room without getting too lost, which she considered a small victory. The room was set for 2 at one end of a table that could have seated 20. The candles were lit. The side settings were precisely arranged. A young man in dark clothes poured water into her glass as she entered and then stepped back silently. She sat down. She waited. At exactly 7 o'clock, the door on the far side of the room opened, and King Callum Drace walked in. He was taller in person than the photographs had suggested. He wore dark trousers and a plain dark shirt. Nothing ceremonial, as Helen had promised, but somehow the simplicity of the clothes made him look no less commanding. He moved the way people moved when they were entirely accustomed to every room accommodating them. Not arrogant exactly, just certain. He stopped at the other end of the table and looked at her. His eyes were a dark brown, almost black in the candlelight. His expression was unreadable. Not cold, she decided, or not precisely cold, more like sealed, as though the surface of his face had been designed to give nothing away. "Miss Price," he said. "Lyra," she said, "please." He gave a very slight nod, as though filing the information. He sat down. There was a pause. "The food will come shortly," he said. "All right," she said. Another pause. "How was the journey?" he asked. Not warmly. It was the question of someone following a protocol. But he had asked it. "Fine," she said. "Nora is a good driver." He nodded. He did not offer anything further. The food arrived, a soup first, then something more substantial, and they ate in a silence that was not exactly comfortable, but was not hostile either. It was simply the silence of 2 strangers who happened to be sharing a table at the end of a very unusual day. Halfway through the meal, Lyra set down her fork and said, "I want you to know that I am not going to make this difficult." He looked at her. It was the most direct his gaze had been since he sat down. "I signed the contract because there were good reasons to sign it," she continued. "I am not going to pretend this is something it is not. But I am also not going to spend my time here being miserable if I can help it. I just thought you should know that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is straightforward of you." "I am a teacher," she said. "We tend to be." Something moved across his face. It was brief and small, and it might have been the beginning of something like amusement, though it did not quite reach a smile. He picked up his fork again. "The household will accommodate whatever you need," he said. "Helen will be your point of contact for arrangements. You are not a prisoner here. You may go where you like within the grounds. If you need to leave the grounds, it should be arranged in advance for your safety." "My safety," she repeated. "There are people who pay attention to who is connected to this house," he said, without particular drama. "It is a practical matter, not a restriction." She nodded. She understood that he was not saying this to control her. He was saying it the way one might state any fact about the environment, the same tone he would have used to say that it rains more often in autumn here, or that the east wind is cold. When dinner ended, he stood. "I will say good night." "Good night," she said. He walked to the door and paused with his hand on the frame. Without turning back, he said, "The gardens are worth seeing in the morning, if you are an early riser. The frost on the hedges is quite good at this time of year." Then he left. Lyra sat at the table for a long moment after the door closed. She picked up her water glass and took a sip. He had told her about the frost on the hedges. It was a small thing, the smallest possible thing. But it was a thing, and she filed it away in the same careful way she filed away things that students said on difficult days. Not the big obvious moments, but the small ones that told you something real about who you were dealing with. She went back upstairs to her room. The fire had been kept going. Her books were where she had left them. Outside the window, the grounds were dark and still, and she could see nothing but shapes in the black. She put on her warmest cardigan, sat in the reading chair, and finally, for the first time that day, managed to read. The days that followed settled into a kind of rhythm that Lyra had not expected. She woke each morning before 7, because that had always been her habit, and the body did not change its habits simply because the walls around it were different. She dressed quietly and went downstairs, and the kitchen staff, who were friendly and efficient in the way of people who had been doing their jobs for a long time, made her tea without her having to ask after the third morning. She took it with her. The gardens were, as Callum had said, worth seeing. She had not expected that either, that she would find genuine comfort in walking the grounds of a building that still felt too large and too unfamiliar. But the gardens were beautiful, in a way that was not showy. They were old and structured and full of things that had been growing for a very long time. There were hedged pathways and low stone walls and trees with branches that spread wide and low. There were frozen flower beds that would be extraordinary in spring, she suspected. There were benches at intervals, placed where the view was particularly good. She walked for an hour every morning, and learned the layout of the grounds the way she learned anything, patiently, incrementally, building the picture one detail at a time. She did not see Callum during the days. Helen had explained, on the second morning, that the king's schedule was demanding, and that he spent most of the day in the East Wing, which contained his working offices and meeting rooms. He was up early and finished late, and the running of the Northern Territories was not a small administrative task. Lyra understood this. She was not offended by his absence. She had not expected to be woven into his daily life immediately. She spent her mornings walking, her afternoons in the library, which was enormous and wonderful, and contained more books than she could read in several lifetimes, and her evenings at dinner, where she and Callum ate at opposite ends of the same table. The dinners were the most interesting part. Callum was not talkative. This much was clear from the first night and confirmed every evening after. He did not make conversation for its own sake. He did not ask questions simply to fill silence. But he was not, Lyra came to realize, absent. He listened. When she spoke, his eyes were on her fully, with the same focused quality she had noticed on the first evening. He did not look away. He did not give the impression that he was waiting for her to finish so that he could say his own thing. He simply listened, and then, sometimes, he responded. And when he did, it was always direct and considered. On the fourth evening, she told him about Oliver. She was not sure why she did. The conversation had moved through a few different topics with the usual gaps in between, and then somehow she found herself talking about her brother, about the accident, about what he had been like before, and what he was like now, and how she visited him as often as she could. She spoke about him matter-of-factly, not looking for sympathy, just telling it the way it was. When she finished, Callum was quiet for a moment. "He is younger than you," he said. "By 5 years," she said. "Do you feel responsible for him?" She thought about that. Not responsible in the way that implies he is a burden, she said carefully. More that he is a part of what makes me make decisions the way I do. He matters to my understanding of what matters. Callum turned his water glass slowly in his hand. "I understand that," he said. It was not an empty phrase. He said it the way people said things they actually meant. She looked at him and thought, there is something in there, under the sealed face and the controlled manner, and the weight of everything that comes with being who he is. There is something in there that recognizes what I just said. She did not know what to do with that observation, so she set it aside and moved the conversation on. On the 6th day, she found the library's music room, a smaller room connected to the library that she had initially walked past without noticing. Inside was a piano, older but well-maintained, and a collection of sheet music in stacked folders. She sat down at the bench and played a few tentative notes. She was not a skilled pianist. She had learned the basics as a child and retained just enough to play simple things slowly. She played a short piece she had learned at 14 and still remembered, halting and careful, and the notes fell into the empty room and disappeared. She did not notice that the door behind her had opened slightly. She only found out later, from Nora, who told her without quite meaning to let it slip, that the king had paused in the corridor outside the music room for several minutes while she played, that he had stood there without entering, and then continued on his way. Lyra turned this over in her mind for a while. On the 7th evening, Callum arrived at dinner before she did for the first time. He was already seated when she came in, and he stood when she entered, a gesture so automatic and courteous that it surprised her. She sat down and thanked him, without thinking, and he said nothing, and sat back down. But there was something in the room that had shifted. She could not name it. It was like a thread that had been loose and had been tied, just slightly, just the smallest amount. He asked her, during the soup, whether she had found the library useful. She said yes, and told him about the music room. He said, "The piano was my mother's. She played every evening when she could." It was the first personal thing he had said to her. Not a fact about the household or the grounds, or an observation about her situation. Something about himself. Something small and real. She did not make a point of it. She simply said, "It is a beautiful instrument. I am not a good enough player to do it justice, but it is beautiful all the same." He said, "Play it anyway. It was not meant to sit there unused." And that was all. But she went back the next morning and played again. She played longer this time, and she made more mistakes, and she did not care, because no one was listening. Or so she thought. She did not yet know that Callum Drace, king of the Northern Territories, had started taking a particular route through the corridor on the east side of the library at the same time every morning. She did not yet know that this corridor happened to run directly alongside the wall of the music room. She would not know this for some time. But on the 9th morning, as she played, she made a mistake, a wrong note that rang out sharply, and she heard, just barely, through the wall, the faintest sound, not a voice, more like the quiet shift of someone adjusting their position, the sound of someone who had been standing still and moved. She stopped playing. She sat at the piano with her hands in her lap. Then she placed them back on the keys and continued. Outside in the corridor, she would later understand, a king stood with his back against the stone wall and his eyes closed, listening to a woman play badly and beautifully in the quiet morning of a house that had been very silent for a very long time. Neither of them acknowledged it, not that day. But the thread tightened, just a little more. And in the private accounting that both of them kept without knowing the other was keeping it, something shifted, from what was dreaded, into something that was simply, and surprisingly, real. She had not planned to go into the garden that night. Lyra was a sensible person who went to bed at a reasonable hour and woke with the intention of having a productive morning, and wandering around unfamiliar grounds in the dark was not something she would normally have considered. But she had not been able to sleep, and the room, as beautiful as it was, had begun to feel like the inside of her own thoughts, which were running in circles and becoming less useful by the minute. So she pulled on her coat over her nightclothes, pushed her feet into the pair of flat boots she kept by the door, and went downstairs and out through the back passage that opened onto the garden terrace. The cold hit her immediately. It was a clear night, which meant no cloud cover and real cold, the kind that pressed against your face and made your breath visible. The grounds were lit only by the moon, which was nearly full, and by the faint light that came from a few windows on the upper floors. The lawn was pale with frost. The hedges were dark shapes on either side of the central path. She walked with her hands in her pockets and told herself she was just getting air. She followed the central path down toward the lower garden, where she had found a low bench on her second morning that had a view of a wide, flat lawn bordered by old stone walls. She liked it there in the morning with her tea. She thought she might like it now too. She turned the corner around a large hedge and stopped. He was already there. King Callum Drace was kneeling in front of a low raised bed on the left side of the path, about 10 feet from the bench she had been heading for. He had a torch set on the ground beside him, and a pair of garden gloves on, and he was doing something with a small plant, adjusting it, staking it. She could not tell exactly. He was not in formal clothes. He wore a dark coat and plain trousers, and he looked, in that moment, entirely unlike a king. He looked like a person. He heard her footstep and turned. For a moment they just looked at each other. The silence was complete. The only sound was the faint movement of wind through the upper branches of the trees behind them. Lyra did not know what to say. She also did not run, which she supposed was something. She simply stood there in her coat and her boots, with her hair loose around her shoulders, and waited for whatever would happen next. Callum turned back to the plant. He made one more small adjustment, then sat back on his heels and looked at what he had done. "You could not sleep either," he said. It was not a question. "No," she said. He did not tell her to go back inside. He did not stand up and become formal and correct. He simply nodded, very slightly, as though this information fit somewhere sensible. She walked forward and sat down on the bench. It was colder than she had expected, and the iron bit through her coat almost immediately, but she stayed anyway. He continued to work. She watched him in the moonlight, the careful way his hands moved, the attention he gave to each small thing. He was not rushing. He was not performing. He was a man doing something he knew how to do, in the one place she would gradually understand, where the enormous weight of everything else temporarily lifted. "What are you planting?" she asked eventually. "Nothing. At the moment," he said. "I am keeping something alive that does not particularly want to survive this cold." He glanced back over his shoulder. "It is a variety of winter rose. My mother grew them." Lyra looked at the bed. She could see, in the torchlight, a few low stems with tight small shapes at the ends that were not quite buds but were not dead either. "She taught you to garden?" she asked. "She tried," he said. "I was not a willing student when I was young. I found it useful later." She thought about what useful meant in that context. She thought about what kind of losses had made something like gardening in the freezing dark at midnight become useful. "I am sorry about your mother," she said. She said it simply, without ornamentation, because that was the only way it meant anything. He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said. He said it the same way, simply. They stayed like that for a while. Him working, her sitting. The moon moved slightly. The frost on the grass caught the light and made the lawn look like something from a story. Lyra thought about the fact that she was sitting in a frozen garden at midnight with a man she had known for 9 days who was technically her husband and who she had been terrified of, and who was currently adjusting the roots of a winter rose with the same careful attention he gave to everything. She found, to her considerable surprise, that she was not afraid of him, not even slightly. She was uncertain. She was in territory she did not understand yet, but fear, the sharp, low kind she had felt when she signed the contract and during the drive north, that had quietly left at some point, she had not noticed it go. He sat back and peeled off one glove and examined the small stem from a closer distance. "Will it survive?" she asked. "I think so," he said. "It is tougher than it looks." He said it about the rose, but she had the distinct feeling, sitting there in the cold dark, that he might have meant something else entirely by it. She did not say this out loud. She sat on the bench and watched the frost, and kept the thought to herself. And Callum Drace knelt in the frozen garden tending to the thing his mother had planted, and neither of them spoke again for a long while, and the silence between them was not empty at all. When she finally stood to go back inside, she said goodnight. He said goodnight back. She walked up the path and did not look back. But she slept, when she finally got back to her room, better than she had slept since she arrived. And she did not try to understand why, because some things are better understood later, when there is enough distance to see them clearly. She simply closed her eyes, and the frost and the moonlight, and the careful sound of someone tending to a living thing, stayed with her, quiet and warm, on the edge of sleep. She should have known it would come from Clara Whitmore. Clara was the kind of woman who entered a room and immediately began calculating who in it was a threat to her position. Lyra had met people like this before, not many, but enough to recognize the particular quality of attention they gave you when they decided you mattered in the wrong kind of way. It was attentive in a way that felt like appraisal, a slow measurement of what you were and what you had, and whether either of those things were things she wanted or wanted to take. Clara Whitmore arrived at the palace for a formal gathering on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Lyra had signed the contract. The gathering was the first official event Lyra was expected to attend as part of the household, a formal dinner, with a collection of regional governors and advisors and their partners. Helen had briefed Lyra about it 4 days in advance, giving her the names and titles of the people who would be present, a brief summary of the relevant politics, and a quiet note that these gatherings were important and that presentation mattered. Lyra had borrowed a dress from the collection that had, apparently, been stocked for her use. She had found the wardrobe in the dressing room fuller than she expected when she arrived, filled with carefully chosen clothes that fit her well enough that she suspected they had not been guessed at. She chose a deep green dress that was elegant without being excessive, and wore her hair up the way she wore it on school days, when she needed to look like someone who had made a decision about herself that morning. It was, she felt, the best version of what she actually was, rather than a performance of something she was not. She came downstairs with 5 minutes to spare and found Helen waiting at the bottom. "You look appropriate," Helen said, which Lyra had come to understand was Helen's version of a compliment. She had come to appreciate Helen enormously in the 3 weeks since she arrived. She was a woman who organized the world the way it needed organizing, and then stepped back from the results with quiet satisfaction. "Who is Clara Whitmore?" Lyra asked. Helen's expression did not change, but there was the faintest pause before she answered. "She is the daughter of Governor Whitmore, one of the senior regional governors. She and the king have a long acquaintance." "How long?" Lyra asked. "Several years," Helen said, in a tone that closed the subject. Lyra understood. The dinner was in the formal dining room, which was a larger and more imposing space than the smaller dining room she and Callum ate in every evening. The table was fully extended and set for 16. The lighting was warmer than she expected. The people gathered there when she arrived were already in conversation in their small groupings, and the sound of it was confident and clipped, the sound of people who were accustomed to gatherings of this kind. She entered with Helen, who guided her gently toward Callum, who was standing near the far end of the room speaking with 2 men who appeared to be in their 60s. He saw her arrive. He excused himself from the conversation and came toward her, and something about the directness of that, the way he did not glance around first or hesitate, but simply moved as though it were the obvious thing to do, settled her more than anything else could have. "Lyra," he said, "how are you?" "Fine," she said, a little like a student on their first day of a new school, but fine. That near smile moved across his face again. She had begun to catalog these, the small, quickly controlled signs of something warmer beneath the surface. "You will know the room by the end of dinner," he said. "You are good with people." She was surprised he had noticed. She was not sure when he had had enough opportunity to observe that about her, but she did not ask. He introduced her to the 2 men he had been speaking with, who were both courteous and measured, the kind of measured that told you they were reserving judgment until they had more information. She shook hands and made conversation, and did not feel overwhelmed, which she had been slightly afraid she might. And then Clara Whitmore was there. She was striking. There was no honest way to say otherwise. She was tall and fair-haired, with the particular kind of grooming that announced careful attention without looking like it had taken any effort. She wore a silver dress, and she moved with total ease through the room, speaking to people with a warmth that looked natural but had, Lyra suspected, been very deliberately cultivated over a long time. When she reached Callum, she touched his arm, a gesture so brief and casual that someone not watching would not have seen it, and said something that made the people nearby laugh. Callum did not laugh, but the corner of his mouth moved. When her eyes found Lyra, they were pleasant and wide, and not warm at all. "You must be Lyra," she said. "I have heard you are settling in well." "I am, thank you," Lyra said. "It can be quite overwhelming at first," Clara said, in a tone that was sympathetic on its surface. "The palace takes getting used to. All those corridors," she smiled. "I remember my first visit, years ago. I was quite lost." "I have a good sense of direction," Lyra said. "I found my way around relatively quickly." Clara's smile held. "Wonderful," she said. The dinner was long. Lyra was seated 4 places away from Callum, which she understood was by arrangement. The seating had been designed to put her in conversation with people she needed to know, which meant she spent 2 hours talking with a governor called Aldous, and his wife, who was a quiet woman named Dora who grew her own vegetables, and had read more books than most people Lyra had met. Lyra liked Dora immediately. They talked about gardens and books, and left politics largely alone, which suited them both. After the dinner came the part that Helen had warned her about, the informal gathering that followed, where people moved around the room with wine, and the conversations became less structured and more revealing. Lyra had a glass of water and moved slowly through the room, listening more than speaking. She was good at listening. It was, in its way, the skill that teaching had built most deeply in her. She was speaking with Dora and Aldous near the window when she heard it. The voice was not particularly low. Clara was standing perhaps 6 feet away, facing away from Lyra, talking with 2 other women. Her tone was the kind that expected to be overheard by the people it was aimed at, and not by anyone else. The arrangement was quite the surprise, Clara was saying. A debt collection, of all things. Apparently the family owed money going back decades. One has to feel for her situation, dragged out of whatever tiny little life she had, and dropped into this. A brief pause. I imagine it is rather a lot to take in. Though of course if she had any background at all, she would have managed the evening with somewhat more polish. One of the other women murmured something. "Oh, I am sure she is perfectly adequate," Clara said. "In a classroom, perhaps." Lyra kept her expression entirely still. She was very good at this, at keeping her face smooth while the inside of her registered something sharp. She had learned it in staff rooms, and in meetings with difficult parents, and in years of being underestimated by people who expected teachers to be easily dismissed. She turned to Dora. "Would you excuse me for just a moment?" she said. Dora, who had excellent hearing, gave Lyra a brief look of pure approval and said, "Of course, dear." Lyra walked, with great calm, to the spot where Clara was standing. She did not hurry. She did not flush. She simply moved until she was at Clara's shoulder and said, with a voice that carried exactly as far as she intended it to, "I do hope the dinner was to your liking." Clara turned. For a fraction of a second her composure slipped, the barest flicker of being caught. Then the pleasant expression returned. "Lovely, thank you," she said. "Are you enjoying the evening?" "Very much," Lyra said. "Dora is wonderful. And Aldous made a very interesting point about the water rights dispute in the eastern parishes. I imagine that will be on the agenda at the next full council. Do you follow those closely?" A pause. "I follow what matters," Clara said. Lyra said, with a small smile that gave nothing away. "I expect the view of what matters differs quite a bit, depending on where one is standing." She met Clara's eyes for just a moment. "Do enjoy the rest of your evening." She moved away. Her heart was beating slightly faster than normal, but her hands were steady, and her face was pleasant, and she felt something that was not quite triumph, but was adjacent to it. The particular satisfaction of having responded to something without letting it reach you. She was reaching for her water glass when she realized that Callum was standing 4 feet to her right. She did not know how long he had been there. He was holding a glass in one hand, and he was looking across the room, not at her. But the angle was wrong. She had spent enough time in classrooms knowing when someone was watching you from the corner of their eye. He had been there for at least part of it. She turned and met his gaze directly, because she was not going to look away from it. He held her gaze for a moment. His expression was the same one he always wore in public, sealed and controlled. But there was something in it that she had not seen before, something that took her a moment to place. It was, she thought, something like regard, not admiration. He was not the kind of man who performed admiration, but recognition, the acknowledgement of someone who had watched you do something well and was noting it without making a production of it. He gave a very brief nod, almost imperceptible. Then he turned back to his conversation. Lyra stood with her water glass and decided that she would need to think about that nod for a while. Not tonight. Tonight was not over yet, and she needed to stay present. But later, alone in the room that was beginning to feel slightly less enormous, with the fire going and the photograph of Oliver on the desk, she went back to Dora and finished the evening standing beside the kindest person in the room, which was where she had decided she wanted to be. And she did not look at Clara Whitmore again. Not because she could not, but because she had already decided that people who reduced others to footnotes in conversations about their own importance were not worth more than one honest response. She had given that. She was finished. At the end of the evening, when the guests were collecting their coats and beginning to move toward the exit, Callum appeared at her side. He did not make a show of it. He was just there. "You handled tonight well," he said quietly. "It was fine," she said. "The thing with Clara," he said, "I did not intend for you to have to manage that." She looked at him. "I managed it for myself," she said, "not because I needed managing." Another brief silence. Then, again, that controlled near expression. "I know," he said. "That is what I meant." She walked up to her room that night and sat in the chair by the window and replayed the evening in her head, all of it, and found that the part that stayed clearest was not Clara, or the dinner, or the long room full of watchful people. It was the nod, and the way he had said, quietly and without ceremony, "That is what I meant." She turned off the lamp and sat in the dark for a little while, listening to the wind outside the window. The frost was back. The grounds were silent. Somewhere on the other side of this building, a man was still awake. She was almost certain of it. She did not know why she was almost certain, only that she was. She went to bed, and she did not sleep easily, but not because she was afraid. The thing about discovering something small and unexpected about another person was that it changed the shape of everything that had come before it. Lyra had been living in the palace for 5 weeks before the shift began, before the careful distance of those first days started to stretch into something with more texture and more risk. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way most real things happened, in small, unremarkable moments that only seemed significant when she looked back on them from a distance. The first thing was the books. She was in the library one afternoon. She spent most of her afternoons there now, reading and occasionally writing letters to Oliver, who could not always read them himself, but whose carers read them to him, and reported that he liked hearing about the palace and the garden and the king. When she pulled a book from the shelf, and found, on the inside cover, a note in neat, narrow handwriting. It was not a dedication, it was an annotation, a comment on the first chapter, written in pencil, small and precise. The argument here is interesting, but the conclusion in chapter 3 contradicts it entirely. She flipped to chapter 3 and found another note. Sure enough, the author's conclusion did, by a narrow margin, contradict the earlier argument, and the penciled note pointed this out in 2 short, dry sentences. She turned back to the cover. No name. She studied the handwriting for a long moment. She had, by that point, seen exactly one example of Callum's handwriting, his signature on a document Helen had shown her in her first week, relating to the formal registration of the marriage contract with the regional council. It was a neat, controlled signature. This handwriting was the same careful, narrow quality, the same pressure of the pen. She stood in the library holding the book and thought, he reads these, and not passively, he argues back. She began checking the other books. It was not something she planned to do deliberately. She simply noticed, over the following days, that more books than she had assumed had these small notes in them. Not all of them, not even most of them. But scattered throughout the shelves, in perhaps 1 in every 8 or 10 books, she would find a page with a penciled observation. They were always specific and always intelligent, and often had a dry quality, an almost arid wit that she recognized, she realized, from the way he sometimes spoke. Brief, without excess, saying more by saying less. She began, in turn, to leave her own annotations, not in response to his. She was careful about that, choosing different books, but her own thoughts in her own hand, in a different corner of the page. Lighter pencil. She had always done this in her own books at home. It was a habit she had learned to suppress in borrowed books, and had apparently failed to suppress here. She did not tell him she was doing it. He did not mention it either. But one evening at dinner, a Friday, she remembered, because the kitchen always made a fish dish on Fridays. He said, as though it were an ordinary observation, I noticed you have been reading the Harmon volumes. She looked up. Yes, she said. I started the second one yesterday. What do you think so far? She told him, specifically and honestly, including the parts where she thought the author was overreaching. She was not sure why she had expected him to respond lightly or dismissively, except that a man of his position and type might have. But he did not. He responded directly, disagreeing with one of her points, and explaining why, with a precision that made her think more carefully about the things she had said, and realized that his counter-argument was actually better than her original position. She told him so. She said, that is a better point than mine. He said, yours was reasonable. Mine just happened to be more accurate. She almost laughed. She pressed it back into a smile, and looked at her plate. When she looked up again, he was still watching her with that focused attention he gave to everything, and she felt, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, that he was not indifferent to her, not even slightly. He was just a person who did not yet know how to reach across the distance he had spent years constructing. She understood that kind of distance. She had never built one herself, but she had taught enough children who had been hurt enough that closeness felt like a danger they could not afford, to recognize what it looked like from the outside. You did not push through it. You waited, patiently, nearby, and you let the person inside it discover by their own process that you were not going to cause harm. She was patient. Patience was possibly her deepest skill. The second thing was the morning. She had been awake since 5:30, which was earlier than usual even for her, and she had gone down to the kitchen and made herself tea without disturbing anyone, and taken it out to the garden terrace. The sun was not yet fully up, the light was thin and gray-blue, and the frost on the lawn caught it and glittered faintly. She heard the door behind her open. She did not turn around immediately. She heard footsteps, not the quick, purposeful steps of a staff member but slower ones, the steps of someone in no hurry. They stopped beside her. She turned. Callum was standing 2 feet away with a cup of coffee and a look on his face that she had never seen before. He looked, she thought, tired. Not ill, not defeated, just tired. The way people looked at 5:30 in the morning when they had been carrying something heavy and had temporarily stopped holding it correctly. "You are up early," she said. "I did not sleep much," he said. She looked out at the lawn. "Does that happen often?" "Often enough," he said. They stood there for a while in the blue early light, drinking their respective things and watching the frost. The grounds were completely quiet. There were no birds yet. Even the wind had stilled. "What keeps you up?" she asked, after some time. She said it carefully, not intrusively, but the way you asked a question you genuinely wanted to know the answer to, and were prepared to accept not getting one. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The weight of decisions made, particularly the ones where either answer was wrong." She thought about this. "You mean the kind where someone is harmed regardless of what you choose?" "Yes," he said. "That would keep anyone up," she said. He did not say anything else, but he stayed there beside her on the terrace for another quarter of an hour, and when he finally went back inside, he said, very quietly, "Thank you for the company." She watched the door close behind him. She stood in the early morning cold and thought about those words, which were ordinary words, and the way he had said them, which was not ordinary at all. The third thing was the letter from Oliver's care facility. It arrived on a Wednesday, addressed to her, and the coordinator wrote to tell her that Oliver was doing well, and that he had been asking repeatedly when Lyra was coming to visit. He had apparently told the coordinator that his sister now lived in a palace with a garden, and had described the winter roses in detail, based on what Lyra had written to him. The coordinator said Oliver seemed proud of this information, in his particular way. Lyra read the letter at the desk in her room, and felt the familiar pull of missing him. Not a desperate pull, because he was safe and cared for, and she would see him soon, but the steady, quiet ache of someone you love, being at a distance from you. At dinner that evening, Callum asked about her afternoon. He had started doing this, asking small, routine questions that amounted to an interest in the shape of her day. She told him about the letter. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When would you like to visit him?" She looked up. "What?" "Your brother," he said. "When would you like to visit? I can arrange the travel." She stared at him. She had not asked. She had not even been thinking about asking. She had been planning, in a vague way, to ask Helen about the protocol for leaving the grounds, which involved advance notice and a security arrangement, and she had been putting it off because it felt like a lot of machinery to involve for a personal visit. "I did not ask you to arrange that," she said. "I know," he said. "I am offering." She looked at him across the table. He was watching her with that direct, clear attention of his. "Callum," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name at dinner, across the table, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She was not sure she had planned to. Why? He considered this for a moment. "Because he is important to you," he said, "and the things that are important to you should not become complicated simply because of where you live now." She held his gaze for a long moment. There was something rising in her chest that she did not quite want to name, because naming it would make it more real, and she was not ready for it to be that real yet. She filed it away, carefully, the way she filed all of it, and said, quietly, "Saturday, if that is possible. I will have Nora ready at 9, he said. And then he went back to his dinner, as though it were the simplest thing, and Lyra sat across from him in the warm light of the smaller dining room and thought, "This is not what I signed up for." She meant it entirely as a good thing. The letters were inside a room that had no reason to be locked. That was the first thing Lyra noticed when she found it. Not that the door was sealed or guarded, but that it was simply closed, and when she had tried it one afternoon, while exploring a wing of the palace she had not yet been through, it had swung open without resistance, as though it had merely been waiting for someone to try. The room was not large. It was one of the smaller rooms on the Upper East Corridor. The ones that Helen had described briefly as archival space during her first week. Lyra had assumed they were full of files and paperwork. This one, the fourth along the corridor, was different. It was a sitting room, old but not neglected. The furniture was covered with pale sheets to protect against dust, which gave it the slightly strange quality of a room that had been paused. There was a window on the far wall with heavy drapes drawn part way. The light came in through the gap in thin, dusty lines. On a small writing desk in the corner, not covered, sat a box. She did not open it immediately. She stood in the room for a moment, taking in the feel of it, the stillness, the sense that nothing in here had been touched for a long time, but that it had once been used by someone who cared about the details. There was a small vase on the windowsill, empty, of fine blue porcelain. There was a framed botanical drawing of a winter rose on the wall. She went to the desk and opened the box. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, folded and stacked with great care. She lifted the top one and unfolded it carefully. The paper was heavy, and the writing was neat and narrow, and she recognized it immediately. She read the first line. "This is for whoever you turn out to be." She stood very still. She read the rest of the letter. It took her about 4 minutes. When she finished, she set it down carefully on the desk, and picked up the next one. She read that one too, and then the next. They were not dated. They were not addressed to anyone by name. Each one began differently. Some began with that opening line, some with others, some with an observation or a question, but they all had the same quality. They were the letters of a man writing towards someone who did not yet exist. Writing into the blank space where a person would eventually be. He was not describing himself, or rather, he was only describing himself in the way that someone does when they are trying to be honest with a stranger they have not yet met. Acknowledging faults, describing limitations, noting the things he suspected he would get wrong, and expressing, without self-pity, a genuine regret for the ways in which this would affect whoever was on the other side of the contract he had always known would eventually exist. One letter said, "I suspect I will not know how to talk to you. I have never been good at the easy kind of talking that makes another person feel at ease. I was not taught it, and I never learned it, and by the time I understood why it mattered, I had already built too much habit around the absence of it. I am sorry for that in advance. I will try to do better than I have managed before." Another letter said, "I want you to know that this was not random. I was very careful about who would bear the consequences of a debt I did not create. I do not expect credit for that. I only want you to know that you were not chosen carelessly." And then, toward the bottom of the box, a different letter, shorter than the others, 3 lines. "I do not know if you will find these. I do not know if it matters whether you do. But if you do find them, and if you are reading this, then I suppose the only thing left to say is this. I hope it is not as difficult as I expect it will be. I hope I manage to be better than the version of myself I am most afraid of. And I hope, in the end, that there is something in this life for you that you did not expect to find." Lyra sat down on the dusty sheet of the nearest chair. She sat there for a long time with the letters in her lap. She thought about the man who had written these. She thought about what it meant that he had written them and sealed them in a box in a closed room where no one had been directed to go, that he had not placed them somewhere she would find them, had not used them as a gesture or a bid for understanding. He had simply written them, probably over a long period of time, and put them away, and in some part of himself that she was only beginning to understand, he had kept them, not thrown them away, kept them. She thought about the dinner on their first night, when he had told her about the frost on the hedges. She thought about the morning on the terrace, when he had thanked her for the company. She thought about Oliver's visit, which had gone beautifully. Callum had arranged a car and a driver, and when she had arrived home that evening, she had found a small bunch of winter roses on the table in her room, cut from the garden, with no note. No note, because some people did not yet know how to write the note, but they found the other way. She had wondered, when she found the roses, whether he had put them there, or whether Helen had arranged it on his behalf. She had not asked, because it had not quite mattered. The act had been what mattered. Now she thought it had been him. She refolded the letters carefully, one by one, and placed them back in the box in the same order she had found them. She closed the lid. She stood and looked at the room for a moment, the covered furniture, the botanical drawing, the empty porcelain vase. She went back to her room. She sat at the writing desk and looked at the photograph of herself and Oliver. She thought for a long time. Then she went downstairs. It was late afternoon, And Callum was still in his office wing. She had never gone there. It was not forbidden. He had told her on the first evening that she could go where she liked within the grounds, but she had respected the separation of that part of the palace as his working space and had not intruded. She stood outside the office corridor and asked the young man at the end of it whether it would be possible to have a few minutes with the king, if he was available. She said it as a question, not a demand. The young man looked slightly surprised but disappeared and came back a minute later and led her down the corridor to a door, which he knocked on and opened. Callum was behind a large desk covered in documents. He looked up when she entered. He did not look displeased. He looked, if anything, slightly careful. "Lyra," he said. "I am sorry to interrupt," she said. "I will not take long." She stood in front of his desk, and she looked at him, really looked at him, in the way that she had been learning to do over 6 weeks of carefully paying attention. The formal bearing. The sealed expression, the dark eyes that gave nothing away until they gave everything away, if you knew what you were looking for. "I found the letters," she said. He went very still. She did not say anything else. She let the sentence be there between them in the quiet office. For a long moment he did not move. She watched the stillness of his face, the way something behind it was being held very carefully in place. Then he set down his pen. "Where were they?" he said. "The 4th room along the Upper East Corridor," she said. He nodded slowly. "I had forgotten which one," he said. "It has been several years." "How many letters are there?" she asked. "I do not know exactly," he said. "I wrote them over a long time, when I needed somewhere to put what I could not say aloud." She stood there and looked at him, and thought about all of it, about the contract and the Tuesday, and the drive north, and the frost on the lawns, the piano, and the garden at midnight, and the breakfast arrangement he had mentioned at the first dinner that he had filed away and retrieved 6 weeks later, about all the small, careful ways he had been managing the impossible distance between 2 strangers, placed in a room together, by a document neither of them had written. "You chose me specifically," she said. "Not just any daughter. You were specific." A brief pause. "Yes," he said. "Why?" she asked. "And I want the real answer, not the administrative one." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was the same, controlled, precise, but there was something under it that she had not heard before, something with no armor over it. "Because the reports said you were kind," he said, "to people who were of no consequence to you, to children, to a brother who could give you nothing back, to a mother who had failed to protect you from this." He paused. "I know what it means to be placed in an unjust situation. I did not want to place it on someone who would be broken by it. I thought, a kind person might endure it, might find a way through it, might not hold it against the person who caused it, if he tried hard enough not to give them reason to." The office was very quiet. Outside, the light was going. The windows were beginning to darken at the edges. Lyra took a breath. "You could have told me," she said. "At the beginning, you could have told me that." "I know," he said. "Why didn't you?" Another long pause. "Because I was afraid," he said, "that it would seem like I was purchasing your goodwill in advance, that it would make the whole thing smaller, somehow, more transactional." She looked at him. "Callum," she said. He looked back. "It was already transactional," she said, and she said it with no cruelty, only plainness. "You did not ruin anything by being honest. You only made it longer to get here." He did not answer for a moment. He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to know, the one that was doing a great deal of work on the inside, while showing very little on the outside. "Here," he said quietly. "Here," she agreed. "This conversation, this, whatever this is." The office held them both for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, "I do not know how to do this well." "I know," she said, "but I have seen the letters. I have seen the garden at midnight. I have seen the roses." She met his eyes. "You are already trying." That is more than most people manage. Something in his face, the sealed quality, the careful armor of it, shifted, very slightly, not completely, not all at once, but enough that she could see, underneath, something unguarded and real. "I am sorry," he said, "for the beginning, for the way this started." "The beginning is done," she said. "I am more interested in what comes next." He looked at her for a long time, and then, for the first time since she had entered his life, King Callum Drace nodded. Not a small nod, not the brief controlled dip he gave in public, a real one. Like something being confirmed. Lyra turned and walked back down the corridor and up the stairs to her room. She sat in the reading chair and picked up her book and held it in her lap without opening it. And outside the window, the darkness settled over the grounds, and the frost began again on the lawns below. She was not afraid. She was not resolved in any dramatic way. She was simply present in the strange, enormous, gradually less unfamiliar life she had walked into 6 weeks ago, with 2 bags and a practical heart. She opened her book. She read 3 full pages without her mind wandering once. The argument started over a map. This was not, she would later think, the least interesting way for their first real argument to begin. It was, in its own way, fitting, because both of them were people who cared deeply about the accuracy of things, and the map was wrong, in a way that affected the thing they were talking about, and neither of them was willing to let it go. It was a Tuesday evening, nearly 2 months after her arrival, and they were in the library after dinner, which had become an occasional habit. She was on one end of the long reading table with a book, and he was on the other end with a folder of papers, and this had happened a few times before, this comfortable coexistence in the same room, without obligation to fill it, and she had liked it. It felt like a grown-up kind of companionship, the kind that did not require performance. Then he had spread a regional development map across one end of the table and made a comment about the eastern boundary of the district it described, and she had looked up and said, without thinking, "That boundary is not accurate." He had looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I grew up 3 villages from that line," she said. "The actual boundary runs about half a mile further east. The river changed course in the flood of 2003, and no one updated the official maps afterward. My father used to complain about it." He studied the map. "The regional office uses these maps," he said. "Then the regional office is working from incorrect information," she said, "which might explain some of the land use disputes in the area over the last 15 years. He looked at her with a focused intensity that was different from his usual kind. This was the look he used when he was genuinely uncertain about something and was recalibrating. "You are saying there is a systematic mapping error that has been influencing regional decisions," he said. "I am saying the map is wrong," she said. "What has followed from that is your area of expertise, not mine." He pulled the map closer and studied it. She went back to her book. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Then he said, "If the boundary runs as you describe, then 3 of the land grant decisions made since 2009 were based on false premise." She looked up. "Then, they may need revisiting." "That is an enormous undertaking," he said. "I know," she said. "But an enormous undertaking done correctly is better than a smaller one done wrong repeatedly." He looked at her with that expression, the recalibrating one. "You are very certain of this," he said. "I lived there," she said. "My father walked that boundary. I walked it with him when I was 12. I know what I saw." "You were 12, he said. "Memory at that age is often more accurate than adults give it credit for," she said firmly. "Particularly memory attached to repeated experience. We walked that boundary every spring with him. It was not a single occasion." He was quiet for a moment. "I am not dismissing you," he said. "I am being careful." "Being careful is good," she said. "Being careful should involve verifying my claim, not assuming it is undermined by my age at the time." Something shifted in his face. He was not irritated. He was, she recognized the look, having to adjust his position, and he was doing it in real time, and it was visible because he was not accustomed to being corrected, and was having to decide how he felt about it. "You are right," he said, after a moment. She blinked. "I should verify the claim through the records, not question the witness," he said. "That is the correct approach." She had not expected that. She had expected the kind of doubling down that people in authority sometimes did, the subtle assertion that the practical knowledge of a person without formal credentials was less reliable than a document. It was a thing she had encountered many times as a teacher, and she had never liked it. "Thank you," she said. "I will have the original survey records pulled," he said. "If your memory is accurate, we will need to audit the affected decisions." "It is accurate," she said. "But I am glad you are checking." He looked at her. "You are not bothered that I questioned it." "You questioned it carefully," she said. "That is different from dismissing it. I would question something I could not independently verify too. I just wanted to make sure you were questioning the evidence, not the source." A long pause. Then he said, very quietly, "Is that something that has happened to you often, being questioned because of the source rather than the evidence?" She considered the question. "Often enough that I notice when it is not happening," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. He looked, she thought, as though he was sorting something, putting something into a folder inside himself marked, "Things to understand better." "I will not do it," he said. Not a promise performed for her benefit. Just a statement of intention, simple and clean. "I know," she said. She went back to her book. He returned to his papers. The library was quiet. The lamp at her end of the table cast a warm pool of light, and outside the long windows, the night was perfectly dark. After about 20 minutes of reading silence, Callum said, without looking up from his papers, "The garden wall on the northern side is being repaired next week. Some of the stone has weakened. You may find part of the lower path blocked." She said, "I will go the long way around." "The long way is better in winter anyway," he said. "The light is different on that side." She read her page. "I know," she said. "I found it last week." He looked up. "Did you go past the old well?" "Yes," she said. "I sat there for half an hour. I used to go there when I was young," he said, "when the palace was loud, when I needed somewhere that was not part of what was happening." She looked up at him. He was looking at the papers, but his attention was elsewhere. He said it the way people said things they had not planned to say, and then allowed themselves to say anyway, because they were in the kind of place and company where it felt possible. "I imagine it was loud sometimes," she said. "It was," he said, "a large family, and then very suddenly it was not, and then the loudness was of a different kind." A brief pause. "I found I missed the first kind, even though I had not always been glad of it when it was there." She looked at him. She thought about a boy going to sit by an old well because the palace was too loud, and then a man going there because it was too quiet. She thought about the kind of loneliness that was not about being alone, but about the particular absence of the specific people who had made a place feel inhabited. "Oliver is like that," she said. "When he is having a good day, genuinely good, the room feels fuller than it is. And when he is not, I notice it in the air." He looked at her. "You would do anything for him," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "Within what is right, yes." What does within what is right mean to you? She thought. It means I would sacrifice a great deal for him, but not my integrity, not his dignity, not the truth. She paused. He would not want me to, even if he could not say so. Callum was quiet for a moment. "That is a very careful kind of love," he said. "I think it is the only kind that holds," she said. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "I did not have a brother. I had cousins who were like brothers, for a time. But ambition makes that complicated eventually." "Do you miss them?" "I miss who they were before they became interested in what I had," he said. He said it without self-pity, just as a fact. She looked at him. She thought about what it would cost a person to watch, repeatedly, as the people around them reorganized themselves in relation to the power they represented, rather than the person they were. She thought about what that did over time, to someone's ability to believe that closeness was safe. "Not everyone is interested in what you have," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said. "Not everyone." The lamp was very warm. Outside was very dark. The library held them in the particular way that libraries held things. Warmly, without demand. "The survey records," she said eventually. "Can I see them when you have them? I would like to verify my memory properly." "Yes," he said. "I will have them sent to the library." "Thank you." She went back to her book. He went back to his papers. But the room was different from how it had been before the conversation. She could feel it. A layer had come off something. Not a dramatic peeling, but the natural way of things that had been gradually becoming something else, and had tonight moved one step further. She did not name it, sitting there in the lamp-warm library. But when she went to bed that night, she lay for a while looking at the ceiling, and thought about a man who had written letters to a person he did not know yet, because he needed somewhere to put what he could not say aloud. And she thought about the way he said things in libraries, and at kitchen tables, and in cold gardens, that he could not quite say in daylight with people around. She thought, "You are safe with me. You do not know that yet, but you will." She turned onto her side and closed her eyes. The survey records arrived 3 days later. She went through them carefully. Her memory was accurate. The boundary was wrong by half a mile, just as she had said. She sent a note to Callum with the relevant page marked and the relevant passage underlined. He came to the library that afternoon with the note in his hand and said, without preamble, "You were right." "I know," she said. For a fraction of a second, something crossed his face that was, unmistakably, amusement. Genuine, unguarded, the fastest smile she had ever seen, gone before it fully arrived. But it had been there. She went back to her book and did not say anything about it, because some things were best honored by pretending you had not seen them. Some things needed space to grow before you shone too much light on them. She turned the page. In the corridor outside, she heard his footsteps go, and then pause, and then continue. She smiled at the book in her lap and read the next paragraph. It started with a broken lock. The East Gate, the service entrance at the far corner of the grounds that the groundskeeping staff used for deliveries, had a lock that had been weakening for some time. The maintenance team had flagged it 3 weeks ago. The work order had been placed. The replacement part was on order. These things took the time they took. What nobody had sufficiently accounted for was that a man named Victor Crane, who had once been a regional advisor to the Northern Territories, and who had been removed from that position 14 months ago following a series of financial irregularities that Callum had personally ordered investigated, would know about the East Gate and its weakened lock. Crane had not taken his removal quietly. He had spoken to several other former officials and to a group of investors who had lost money when the irregularities were exposed. He had been building, quietly and with patience, a case for what he described as the instability of King Callum's authority. He had been waiting for the right moment and the right tool. He found what he thought was a tool in the information that a new, inexperienced woman with no formal political background had been installed at the center of the ruling household as the king's wife. A woman from a small town with no connections and no protection. A woman who, if frightened enough, might be the thing that exposed Callum's one visible vulnerability. He organized 3 men and the East Gate on a Wednesday evening when the security rotation had a gap of 8 minutes. Lyra was in the garden. She had gone out later than usual because she had been deep in a book and had lost track of the hour and had not eaten enough at dinner, and the cold air was useful, she had found, for clearing the particular kind of restlessness that came after too many hours indoors. She was wearing her coat and her boots, and she had gone down to the lower garden where the old well was, because she had found she liked it there, even in the dark. She had been sitting on the low wall surrounding the well for perhaps 10 minutes when she heard the gate. It was not the usual sound. The usual sound of the service gate was a specific creak. She knew it from mornings when deliveries came. This was different. It was careful, deliberate. The sound of a gate being opened slowly by someone who did not want to be heard. She sat very still. She heard footsteps on the gravel path, more than one set, moving along the inside of the wall, keeping to the shadow, moving in the direction of the terrace. She did not panic. She recognized, with a clarity that surprised her, that panicking would use up exactly the 4 seconds she needed to think. She thought. She was in the lower garden, below the sight line of anyone on the main grounds. She was in the shadow of the old stone wall. She had her phone in her coat pocket. She did not have a direct line to the security team. She had Helen's number and Nora's number and Callum's number, which he had given her quietly during her second week, and which she had never used. She pressed his name. He answered on the second ring. She said, very quietly, "There are people in the grounds. They came through the East Gate. I am at the old well. I do not know how many. At least 2, possibly 3. There was a pause of perhaps 1 second. Then he said, very calmly, "Stay exactly where you are. Do not move. Help is coming." The call stayed open. She did not say anything else, and neither did he. She could hear, faintly on his end, rapid movement and a door, and his voice giving orders that were short and clear and completely without panic. She sat on the low wall of the old well in the dark and breathed steadily. The footsteps on the main grounds were moving toward the terrace entrance of the palace. She could hear them faintly. 3 sets, she was fairly sure now. They were moving with purpose. They had a specific destination. 5 minutes later, everything happened very quickly. There was the sound of the security team, which she now knew operated at a size she had not appreciated before this evening, moving through the grounds with a speed and a silence that suggested they had practiced exactly this scenario. She heard brief, sharp instructions. She heard footsteps running. She heard what might have been the sound of something falling on the terrace. And then, from the direction of the main grounds, clear. And then, clear. And then, on the phone still open in her hand, a voice close to the speaker, not Callum but someone near him, saying, "All 3 secured, sir." The line went quiet for a moment. Then Callum said, directly into the phone, "Lyra." "Yes," she said. "Are you injured?" "No," she said. "I am entirely fine." "Stay there," he said. "I am coming to you." She sat on the wall and looked at the old stone of the well, and the dark of the sky above it, and the thin shape of the moon behind a cloud. Her hands were steady. She observed this with something like academic interest. She had expected them to shake. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. That particular step, faster than usual. Not quite running, but close to it. He came around the corner of the hedge and stopped when he saw her. He crossed the distance quickly and stood in front of her. He looked at her face, her hands, her posture, the way someone looked when they were checking for damage. "I said I was fine," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to see it myself." She looked at him. In the thin moonlight, his face had a quality she had not seen before. The sealed surface was there, but something beneath it was closer to the surface than she had ever seen it. Something that had been shaken loose by the minutes between her phone call and this moment. He sat down on the wall beside her, right there, in the dark and the cold, still breathing slightly faster than usual. They sat for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "They were coming for you, not me. I just happened to be outside." "I know," he said. "But you are not separate from me. Not anymore." He said it carefully, the way he said things that cost him something. "When your name came up on my screen, He stopped. She waited. "I understood something," he said. "About how much is at stake, for me, in a way that surprised me." She turned her head and looked at him. He was looking at the well. The muscle in his jaw was tight. "Callum," she said. He turned and looked at her. "You do not have to wrap it in formal language," she said quietly. "Not with me. Not here." He looked at her for a long moment. In the thin dark, his eyes were very steady. "I was afraid," he said. Simply. "When I heard your voice on that call, I was afraid." She held his gaze. She thought about the kind of man who had spent a very long time building walls against exactly this kind of vulnerability. The kind of man for whom saying that one sentence was an act of considerable courage. "I know," she said. "I could hear it, very faintly." "I did not want you to hear it," he said. "I know," she said again. "But I am glad I did." He looked at her. He was doing the thing he did, measuring, calculating, trying to understand whether the ground was safe. She recognized it now with great clarity. She reached across the small space between them on the wall and placed her hand over his. He did not move. He looked down at her hand. Then he looked back up at her. She said, without looking away, "I told Oliver you were nice. He said he knew. He said I write about you all the time in my letters." Something crossed his face. "Do you?" he said. "Yes," she said. A pause. "I think about you," he said, "during the day, in meetings. I find myself thinking, I should tell Lyra about this. She would find that interesting. She would disagree with that." His voice was quiet and entirely without pretense. "I have not thought that way about anyone in a very long time." She left her hand where it was. His was very still beneath it. He had not turned it over to hold hers, but he had not removed it either. The not removing felt significant. "We are past the hard beginning," she said. "I think." "Yes," he said. "I think we are." The grounds were very quiet. Somewhere beyond the wall, the security team was doing what it needed to do. Inside the palace, things were being managed. The world of kings and advisors and betrayals and documents was doing what it always did. Out here, by the old well in the dark, 2 people sat on a low stone wall. and the distance between them that had been wide and deliberate and carefully maintained was now simply small. So small she could feel the warmth of his coat sleeve against her arm. "Come inside," he said eventually. Not an order, an invitation. She stood. He stood beside her. They walked back up the garden path side by side, and the frost was on the lawn, and the palace was lit from within. And it looked, she thought, like what it had been slowly becoming for the past 2 months. It looked like somewhere that someone lived. Not just a king. A person. 2 people. She went inside. He stayed at the terrace door for a moment, looking back at the garden. She watched him from inside the doorway, and she saw him stand there with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the place where she had sat on the stone wall, and been very still, and made the right call, and kept her hands steady. Then he came inside too. The knock came at her door just after 7 in the morning, which was earlier than Helen usually appeared, and was therefore not Helen. Lyra was already awake and dressed, sitting at the writing desk with a cup of tea that she had made herself in the small kitchen adjacent to her room, a discovery she had made in the 3rd week, and had been deeply grateful for ever since. She set the cup down and said, "Come in." It was not a staff member, it was Callum. He was dressed for the day, formal, the way he usually was by the time she saw him, and he held a plain envelope in one hand. He looked, she searched for the right word, not uncomfortable, but aware of himself. The way people looked when they were doing something they had decided to do before the part of them that argued against it could take over. "I apologize for the hour," he said. "I was up," she said. "Sit down if you like." He did not sit. He stayed near the door, which was its own kind of honesty. He was here for a specific thing, and he did not want her to mistake it for something else yet. She recognized the instinct. She had felt it herself, in the early weeks, standing carefully at the edges of rooms. He held out the envelope. "This came this morning," he said. "It is from the care facility. For you. It was marked urgent, and I wanted you to have it immediately." Her stomach tightened. She crossed the room and took the envelope. Her name was on it, in the coordinator's handwriting. Urgent, underlined. She opened it. She read the single page inside. Oliver had had a difficult night. He had become very distressed. The coordinator wrote this with care, not alarming her more than necessary, and had been asking for Lyra. He was calm now. He was resting. But the coordinator wanted Lyra to know, and to come if she could, and to call as soon as possible. She lowered the letter. She stood with it in her hand, and felt the familiar cold that came when something happened to Oliver. The same cold that had hit her when the call came about his accident, and every time since when things had not gone smoothly. She had learned to manage it quickly, to fold it into practicality, because falling apart did not help him. But it took a moment. It always took a moment. Callum had not moved. He was watching her. "Is he all right?" he said. "He will be," she said. "He had a hard night. He needs me to come." "I know," Callum said. "Nora is already downstairs. The car is ready whenever you are." She looked at him. "You read the letter?" "The coordinator sent a brief message to the household this morning as well," he said. "Protocol. When urgent correspondence is received for a member of the household. I saw it before I brought the envelope to you." He paused. "I thought it better to bring it myself." She looked at him, standing in her doorway, in his formal shirt, with the envelope he had carried up 3 flights of stairs himself, rather than sending through the household delivery system. She thought about the number of small things that had added up to this moment. "Give me 10 minutes, she said. She put on her coat and packed a small bag, her wallet, a book for Oliver, the photograph, and she was downstairs in 8. The drive to Oliver's care facility took just over 2 hours. Lyra sat in the back of the car and called the coordinator from her phone, and listened carefully to everything she was told, and asked the right questions. Oliver was calm. He had been frightened in the night, by a dream he could not explain, and the distress had escalated before the night staff could settle him, and he had asked for Lyra by name, which was itself a good sign. His ability to reach for the people who mattered to him was something they tracked carefully. He was fine. He simply needed to see her. She arrived to find him sitting in the sunroom of the facility, wearing the blue jumper she had bought him for his birthday, looking smaller than she remembered and entirely himself. When she came through the door, he made the sound he made when he was genuinely pleased, a soft, repeated sound, a little like a quiet exhale, and she crossed the room and sat beside him and took his hand. "I am here," she said. He looked at her hand in his, and then at her face, and then back at the window. The coordinator brought tea. Lyra stayed for 4 hours. She did not talk about the palace much. She talked about the garden, about the books she had been reading, about a small bird she had seen on the windowsill of the music room, that had sat there for an astonishing length of time before flying away. Oliver listened in the way he listened, which was fully and visibly, and without the performance of engagement. He simply was engaged, in the complete way that had always been one of the most wonderful things about him. She told him about the winter roses. He remembered. He asked if they were still alive. "I think so," she said. "The king checks on them." Oliver looked at her carefully. Oliver, who had been told all his life that he was not perceptive, was in fact enormously perceptive in his own particular way. He looked at her, the way he always looked at her when he was deciding something. "He seems nice," Oliver said. Lyra blinked. "I have not told you that much about him," she said. Oliver turned back to the window. "You have been writing about him a lot," he said, with the simple logic of someone who saw no reason to dress up an observation. Lyra sat with this for a moment. She realized, in her letters to Oliver, she had been telling him about the garden and the piano and the library and the frost and the conversations at dinner and the letters in the box, and all of those things, without her quite intending it, had Callum in them, some of them only slightly, some of them more directly than she had realized until now. She had been writing about him. She reached over and squeezed Oliver's hand. "He is," she said quietly. "He is quite nice." On the drive back, the afternoon light was already going. She sat in the back of the car and looked out at the hills, and thought about what Oliver had noticed that she had been carefully not naming. She was not afraid of it. She was honest with herself, which was something she valued about the way she was built. She did not tend to avoid things, only to approach them at the right pace. She thought, "You are becoming important to me. Not a simple thing, not a resolved thing, just a true one." The palace came into view around the bend in the road, the way it always did, all at once, without warning. She had stopped finding this unsettling. Now it simply looked like what it was, the place where she lived. Nora pulled up to the front steps. Lyra stepped out. Callum was standing at the top of the steps. He was not waiting in the way of someone pacing or performing concern. He was simply standing, coat on, hands in his pockets, watching the car come up the drive. And when she got out, he came down the steps with that particular walk of his, purposeful, no wasted movement, and stopped in front of her. "How is he?" he said. "Better," she said. "He was glad to see me. He will be fine." He nodded. He did not reach for her or make a gesture of comfort. That was not who he was, not yet. But he looked at her with complete, undivided attention, the kind that said, "I am glad you are back. I was paying attention to the time it took." "Thank you for having the car ready this morning," she said. "Of course," he said. They went inside together, walking side by side through the large front door and into the hallway. The fire in the main hall was going. The palace smelled of wood and warmth. A member of the kitchen staff appeared to ask whether she would be eating this evening, and she said yes, please. At dinner, they talked for longer than usual, about Oliver some, about the facility and the coordinator and what the night had been like for him. But then, gradually, about other things, about a book she had been reading in the library, about a regional matter he had been working through, about the difference between what people expected leadership to look like and what it actually required. She said something that made him go quiet and then say, "I had not thought about it that way. That is a better way to think about it." She said, "You are allowed to think about things differently from how you have always thought about them." He looked at her. "Is that permission?" "It is an observation," she said. "Permission is not mine to give." But he was almost smiling. She could see it at the edges of his expression, that restrained warmth that she had been cataloging for weeks. It was there more often now, more accessible. She did not remark on it, because remarking on it would make him aware of it, and he would pull it back. So she just let it be there, and looked down at her plate, and felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for a long time. After dinner, walking back toward the stairs, he said, quietly, in the corridor, where no one else was nearby, "I am glad you went to him today, that you did not feel you had to ask." She stopped walking, and turned to look at him. "I did not have to ask," she said, "because you made sure of that. From the beginning. He looked at her steadily. It was the least I could do. Callum, she said. He waited. The least you could do, and the least most people would have done, are not the same thing, she said. I know the difference. He did not answer for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, I know you do. And that was all. She went upstairs. He went to his office, she supposed, or wherever he went in the evenings, when the day had closed. She sat in the reading chair with the lamp on, and the fire going, and the photograph of Oliver on the desk, and she thought about the fact that she had a brother who had told her she had been writing about someone a lot, and that he had been right, and that she was no longer pretending that meant nothing. It meant something. She was not ready to say it aloud yet, but she held it carefully, the way you held something new and fragile before you were certain of it, gently, without gripping. The frost was back outside. It was becoming familiar now, the frost, the dark, the stillness. She opened her book and read until the fire burned low, and then she went to bed, and she slept well, and in the morning she went back to the garden, and the frost was exactly where she had left it, and the world was the same as it had been, and also somehow entirely different. The year had the particular quality of things that could not have been predicted. Lyra stood in the garden on the morning that marked 1 year since the car had come to collect her, and she thought about the woman who had gotten into that car, the practical, careful, quietly terrified woman with 2 bags and a signed contract, and a heart that had shut itself up against expectation, because expectation had not seemed safe. The garden looked different in late autumn than it had when she arrived. Some of it was the same, the old trees, the stone walls, the shaped hedges, the wide flat lawn with the frost that still came every clear morning, but some of it had changed. The winter rosebed had been expanded over the summer. She and Callum had done it together in June, a Saturday morning with trowels and rootstock, and a great deal of debate about spacing that had ended with her being right, and him acknowledging it with that quick, controlled expression that she now knew was his version of conceding a point, while looking like he was merely thinking. There was a new bench by the old well, not placed there by the ground staff. She had asked Callum if they could have one put there, and one morning it had simply appeared, in exactly the right position to catch the morning sun and look out over the lower lawn. She sat on it most mornings now, with her tea. There was a light in the music room window that she could see from the garden path. She had played more this year than in the previous 10 years of her life, not because she had become better, she had not, particularly, but because she had stopped caring about being better, and had started caring simply about the playing itself. Callum had, at some point in the summer, asked her to play something specific for him, a piece she had mentioned once, briefly, in passing, that her father had liked. She had not been sure he remembered. He had. She had played it for him one evening, and he had sat in the chair by the window and listened with his eyes closed, and she had watched his face and thought, this is what it looks like when someone lets themselves have something. She had her own study now, his mother's room, relit and used, full of her own books alongside the ones that were already there. She had kept the botanical drawing on the wall. She had added a few things of her own, a print she had bought in the market town during a visit last spring, a small plant on the windowsill, the writing planner she had packed on her first day, and had eventually, after several months, started using again, not for school schedules but for her own writing, which had become a quiet and important part of her days, in a way she had not anticipated. She had gone back to teaching, in a limited way, not the school, that life was behind her, and she was honest with herself about the fact that it had changed. But she had asked Helen, in the spring, about the educational situation in the local area, and Helen had told her about a community center in the nearest town that ran programs for children who needed additional support. Lyra had spoken to Callum about it. He had listened without interrupting. Then he had said, "What do you need to make it work?" She had told him. He had made one phone call. 3 weeks later she had a teaching program running twice a week, and she drove herself to it in a car that did not have any royal markings on the outside, because she had been very clear that this was her own thing, and not a public occasion for anyone. The children in the program were wonderful. They were the kind of children who had slipped through the gaps, not unintelligent, not without capacity, but underserved by the systems that were supposed to catch them. She spent 4 hours a week with them, and came home tired in the best possible way. Oliver had visited twice. The second time, he had stayed for 3 days. in the room that had been prepared for him with the kind of careful attention to detail that still made her throat tighten when she thought about it. Callum had met him on the first visit. A brief, slightly formal introduction that Oliver had managed with his characteristic straight-faced honesty, telling Callum that the palace was a lot bigger than I thought, and that the garden was quite good. Callum had said that he agreed on both counts, and that the garden was better since Lyra arrived, and Oliver had said, yes, she is good at that, without specifying what that was, and Callum had looked at Lyra, and she had looked at him, and neither of them had said anything, because nothing needed to be said. Oliver had told her on his second visit that he liked Callum because he listens properly. She had agreed. She walked now to the bench by the old well and sat down with her tea. The morning light was coming in at a low angle over the eastern wall, the way it did in late autumn, and the frost on the lawn was catching it. The grounds were quiet. The birds had not started yet. She heard the back door of the palace open and close. She did not turn around. She knew the sound of that step. Callum came around the corner of the hedge and stopped when he saw her, the way he still did. That brief pause before he continued, as though he was always slightly glad to find her where he expected her to be. He came and sat on the bench beside her. He had his coffee. He was in his coat, the dark one he wore in the mornings before the day required him to be anything in particular. They sat and looked at the garden. 1 year today, she said. Yes, he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the frost on the lawn, his expression the quiet one, the one that was doing something on the inside, that he sometimes shared and sometimes kept. What are you thinking? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I am thinking about the version of this day that I imagined, a year ago. The version I was afraid of. And, she said. And it does not resemble this at all, he said. He turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were direct and warm in the morning light, and there was nothing sealed in them, nothing managed. Just him, the actual version, the one she had been learning for 12 months. Were you afraid of me specifically? She asked. Or just of the whole thing? Both, he said. Of the thing. And then, once I met you, of you specifically. She raised an eyebrow. You were afraid of me. You are not an easy person to be afraid of, he said, which made it worse. I could not justify the fear once I understood you. I had to simply have it and also recognize it was not rational. She thought about this. What were you afraid of, specifically? He looked at the garden for a moment. That you would see exactly what I was, he said. And that it would not be enough. She held this sentence for a moment. She thought about the letters in the box, and the breakfast, made from something she had mentioned once, and the way he had run. Not quite run, but close, when her name came up on his phone in the dark garden. She thought about the small study where his mother's books still stood alongside hers, and the bench by the old well, and the winter roses that had survived another cold season. Callum, she said. He looked at her. I saw exactly what you were from. Fairly early on, she said. You are not good at hiding things from people who are paying careful attention. You should know that. I have begun to understand that, he said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. The near thing she had been cataloging all year, which had gotten closer over time, and was now very close indeed. And it was more than enough, she said. It was considerably more than I expected to find. He looked at her in the morning light, with the frost on the lawn and the pale sky above the old trees, and the quiet of a house that had been very silent for a long time, and was not any more. He looked at her with everything he had. None of it managed, none of it sealed. I did not expect to find you, he said. I expected to get through it. I expected to manage it correctly, and be kind, and not cause unnecessary harm, and live with what I had arranged. I did not expect. He stopped. He tried again. I did not expect this. She set her tea down on the bench beside her, and she looked at him and she thought, I signed a piece of paper in my mother's kitchen, expecting to survive, and instead I woke up here, on a bench by an old well on a frost-white morning, next to a man I did not know, and now know better than almost anyone, and the life I did not choose is the life I would choose if I could choose again. Neither did I, she said. He reached over and took her hand. He did it the way he did everything now, without hesitation, without ceremony, decided and real. She held it. The morning light came fully over the wall, and fell across the frozen garden, and the winter roses that were going to bloom again, and the old well, and the bench, and the two people on it, who had arrived at this particular morning by a route that neither of them would have chosen, and that both of them were, somewhere in the honest center of themselves, entirely glad to have traveled. The first bird of the morning started up in the far trees, then another. The light continued coming. She did not need to say what she was thinking. He knew. She could see it in the way he was sitting. Not upright, not managed. At ease. The particular ease of someone who has put something down that they have been carrying for a very long time. She squeezed his hand once, gently. He squeezed back. They sat in the winter morning and drank their respective drinks and watched the frost slowly give way to the light, the way it did every morning at this hour, the way it would again tomorrow and the morning after that, in the garden that was now theirs, in the life that had been handed to them and that they had, impossibly and perfectly, chosen to keep.